Good afternoon. I'm James Beeney and I'll be your moderator today. Relating an ever-changing business environment to business management is a very challenging thing, but a very, very important thing for competitive and growing businesses, which is why I'm very excited to introduce the first in a two-part webinar series on building an organization for a rapidly changing world today. So the two presenters who I'm going to introduce to you are Andrew Beal, who is a partner with Optimity Advisors. He has a very extensive experience leveraging digital technologies for businesses and has worked extensively with public and private organizations on both sides of the pond with this regard. And Rod Collins, who's our Director of Innovation. So he is former Chief Executive of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Federal Employee Program. And during his tenure, he increased market share by 10 percentage points. And he attributes this success to innovative business management, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So before we start the webinar, I just want to mention that we will be welcoming questions throughout. All you need to do is type into your question into the side panel, and we'll deal with those questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to turn you over to Rod, who will start the webinar.
Thank you, James. Today's business leaders face a very difficult and unprecedented challenge. The world is changing faster than most organizations. Every business in every industry, no exceptions, has been overtaken by an incredible accelerating pace of change. We now live in a permanently fast-forward world, a hyper-connected world, if you will, where the rules are suddenly very different, where customers now, rather than business leaders, set the pace for market change, and where innovation has suddenly become a core competency for business growth. Put very simply, we now find ourselves in a new world with new rules, and the consequences for not learning these new rules can cause stalwart companies who've been around for decades to vanish overnight. Do you remember Kodak? The key organizational challenge for business leaders today is to manage at the pace of accelerating change. And to do that, your organization has got to be designed to move fast. It needs to be designed to readily adapt to rapid change. Well, why is it that suddenly now the rules for the way the world of business works are changing? We have here a graph of a phenomenon known as Moore's Law. And for those unfamiliar, Moore's Law says that our ability to store and process information doubles every 2 years. This was an observation made by Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel. Now, we're showing this graph as an analogy for what is happening in the world around us. And this graph, we begin in 1984, and we chose that because that's the year that Steve Jobs takes the computer and transforms it from an institutional piece of equipment into a household appliance. And whatever our ability is to store and process information in 1984, we call that 1 unit. And then what this chart does is double that unit every 2 years. And you see this graph has 2 parts. The first part, between roughly 1984 and 2004, is a linear line. And that represents the world that we are leaving. All throughout the 21st century, the world of business has been essentially a linear world based upon 2 fundamental assumptions. The first is that the smartest organizations leverage the intelligence of their smartest individuals, which is why over that time we tended to build top-down hierarchies. Because the theory is, if the smartest people are those who rise to the top of organizations, and if we give them the ability to command and control the work of everyone else in the organization, then everybody will work smarter than they otherwise would if left to their own devices. And this has been a fundamental assumption for management since its inception in the late 19th century. The second assumption is that the past is a proxy for the future. And this has been the elixir for business leaders all throughout the 20th century. And the idea is this: if you are responsible for the future, which of course is always the job of the business leader, then the best way to do that is to understand the past. Because if the past is a proxy for the future, if I understand all the relationships in our business in the past, I know all the important connections, what I can then do is take that important data and then I can forecast it out. Because a lot of business strategy throughout the 20th century was forecasting. That was a key skill in business strategy. And chances are, if I really did understand well the last 5 years, then I would be correct in my forecasts. And in the linear line, you can see that 2000 and the year 2000 is roughly an extrapolation of the year 1995. Well, the second part about curve is the exponential curve. And the rules are very different here because the two basic assumptions behind management for the last century are no longer true. You see, the smartest organizations today, they don't leverage the individual intelligence. What they do is they leverage collective intelligence because they understand nobody is smarter or faster than everybody. And they understand that in a rapidly changing world where things keep changing, there are many times where diversity actually trumps ability. That's why, for example, Google's PageRank became the #1 search engine because it was the first one that leveraged collective intelligence. And then the second assumption is also no longer true. The past is no longer a proxy for the future. As a matter of fact, I think everyone on this webinar will agree that the future is very likely to be different from the past. And as you see on this curve, if you were an executive in the year 2005 and you needed to create the future of your business, say in 2010, if you extrapolate from the period 2000 through 2005, well, you're likely to miss the mark if you linearly extrapolate that. And so this graph serves as an analogy to show that somewhere in 2004, we moved into a very, very different world. The business writer Thomas Friedman captured it very succinctly when he said in 2004, Facebook didn't exist. 4G was a parking space. An app was something you sent to a college. LinkedIn was probably a prison. Tweet a sound a bird made, and Skype was probably a typo. None of these things existed in 2004, and yet today they form the context of the world in which we live and are dramatically impacting business. It turns out in this new world with its new rules that collective intelligence is indeed the most reliable window into the future in a rapidly changing world. When companies are designed for innovation, the fundamental operating dynamics have more to do with iterating and co-creating than they do with planning and controlling. This is indeed a paradigm shift for the fundamental ways we design organizations and the fundamental ways that we do business. To go into this a little more, I'm going to turn this over to Andy.
Thanks very much, Rod. So exactly as Rod has just said, that the processing power that we now have at our fingertips is presenting a whole new load of opportunities. And it's not just the processing power, it's how the data is also collected. So, if we start off some of these examples here, so the Internet of Things, that's allowing data to be picked up about our behavior in completely new ways. You've got sensors in clothes, Fitbits, there's all sorts of ways in which data is being picked up from fridges, etc. Visualization, I think people are understanding now that how people access information is completely changing. The development of smartphones, it's amazing how much information you can take on board in a very small screen. But it's how it's presented, how space is used, how colors are used, how graphs are used, how messages are taken on board. There's a much greater understanding of the importance there. Real-world experimentation. In the old world, RC, randomized controlled trials, big trials are set up, experiments are set up, take years to get results, loads of ethical approval needed, etc. In the modern world, this actually can now be seen as real-world experiments where the data has been collected, counterfactual populations can be described and identified, and you can look at what the real differences are in real situations as opposed to potentially in laboratory conditions. New currencies, Bitcoin, etc. These currencies are sort of really at the early stages now and are being used internally by some organizations, but they have potentially the power to transform the way that people trade. Behavioral insights. A lot of the understanding about how demand is created for products and services, how organizations operate, it's a lot about understanding how our behaviors are influenced by our environment, by others, by the information we see, by incentives, etc. And those things, through the work of Dan Kahneman and others, are really coming to the fore. Customer data, and Rod's already alluded to the fact that the real focus now is shifting towards adding customer value, creating new customers, customer experience, and linking data at the level of the customer, both historical data around that individual and potentially what might happen in the future. So linking data at the customer level is critical. And then we've got the technology. Once you've identified your frame, the sorts of analysis you want to do, the processing power allows the technology to really power through it and undertake these analyses in very new ways. And there are new platforms available now for both storing and analyzing data. So the use of NoSQL databases, data storage solutions, etc., allows you to focus far more on making use of the data as opposed to necessarily how it is all stored and organized. And again, that's providing a lot more flexibility, and the time to delivering value is massively accelerated. So, and in this environment, there are some organizations, some companies that have really taken this on board, and some of these organizations are really thriving. And here are some of them. Some of these are sort of well-known names, but some are not. And Rod already alluded to a couple that haven't really made it. So Blockbuster, for example, why didn't they create online distribution video centers? They had the massive market share, they had the lead in that environment, but they never took it to online. Why didn't they do that? Borders, similarly, though they were predominant, trusted brand in the market, but why didn't they do, again, online book sales? Why did people at Amazon take that on board? IBM, again, why didn't they create Windows and the sort of solutions there? BlackBerry, well, there's a tale. So they could have been in the position to create the iPhone. They have a massive market share, but they didn't. I don't think they really understood the customer or what the customer wanted and how these devices could be used by broader communities. And Xerox, again, they went down a particular route, and they could have created the iMac again. It was about focusing on the customer, and the iMac would fill a space which nobody knew was there, but visionary people could understand that there was a space for a new sort of device in the home. And finally, again, sort of Kodak, they could have they defined themselves as people that looked at film and old technology as opposed to thinking about the digital opportunity and digital products. So again, they lost out. So what's the secret to all of this then, Rod?
Okay, the secret sauce is networks. What we learned from the Vanguard companies is when your most important business challenge is to manage at the pace of change, you design your organization as a peer-to-peer network, not a top-down hierarchy. While this is a dramatic and for many an unfamiliar change in organizational design, it is a critical change for business leaders who are serious about innovation, for the simple reason that hierarchies are not designed for innovation. In fact, they are designed to inhibit innovation. That's because in hierarchies, too many people have the authority to kill a good idea or keep a bad idea alive. In hierarchies, you can get fired if you work on an idea your boss has ordered you not to pursue. At a Vanguard company like Google, if you disobey the boss, you might actually get a bonus if your idea works out. A few years back, Some of the people on the webinar may recall the annoying pop-ups that used to show up on our laptops and computers. And it annoyed Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google. And he felt it was important for Google to find a way to stop the annoying pop-up ads. He was having a conversation with one of his engineers one day who had an idea on how to do it. The engineer outlined the idea. Larry listened to it and thought it was absurd and ridiculous and said, that will never work. It's a dumb idea. Don't devote any attention to that. That will be a complete waste of your time and resources. Well, the engineer didn't agree. So he decided that he would not follow Larry Page's orders and worked on his idea anyway. And when he had perfected it, he decided to beta test it on none other than Larry Page's computer. So he quietly went in one night, puts it on Larry's computer, goes away. A couple weeks later, he runs into Larry Page in the hall. And Larry says to him, my goodness, the pop-up ad problem, it's gone. My computer is working terrifically. Did you solve the problem? And the engineer said, yes, I did. He said, how did you do it? And at that point, the engineer told him, well, I just followed through on the idea that you thought was stupid and ridiculous. And Larry Page looks at him befuddled and says, but I told you not to work on that. And the engineer smiled and says, yes, I know, but I worked on it in my 20% time. You see, at Google, the purpose of the 20% time is to give workers space so that they can disobey the orders of the supervisors. Because Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the co-founders of Google, understand that a critical skill that organizations have to have today, an important part of their structure, is that nobody, including the CEO, should ever have the authority to kill a good idea or keep a bad idea alive. And so we have the key ingredients of a big shift. We are moving from top-down hierarchies to peer-to-peer networks. We're moving from a world where individual intelligence was king to a world in which collective intelligence is most important. We're moving from a world where we had almost an exclusive focus on linear analytics. Now we're moving to a world where we have to blend creativity and analytics. We have to, if you will, synergize analytical thinking with design thinking. It's not that numbers aren't important anymore. It's that numbers aren't enough. Remember, perhaps one of the smartest numbers people who ever lived, Albert Einstein, said, everything that you can count doesn't necessarily count. And everything that counts can't necessarily be counted. And in a fast-changing world, having the capacity to blend creativity and analysis is critical. We're moving from master plans where we assume the world is fixed and all we have to do is stick to the plan, to iterative experiments. The focus is no longer on compliance. It's not do what you're told. It's collaboration. How can we all work well together? The interest has shifted from having the right answers to discovering the right questions. And finally, and most importantly, the very fundamental dynamics of how management works is going through a radical transformation all throughout the 20th century, right back to Frederick Taylor, the father of what was then known as modern management in the early 20th century, was all about planning and controlling. The foundation of strategy was planning. The foundation of execute was control. Get a good fixed plan, make sure nobody deviates, and all will be well. In the new world, the foundation for strategy is now iteration, and the foundation for execution is co-creation. There are no longer fixed plans in the fast-changing world. It's not that planning isn't done. It's just that planning needs to be continually adapted to changing circumstances. And that's why the dynamics of management now are about iterating and co-creating. And the reason that peer-to-peer networks are better organizational forms today than top-down hierarchies is that networks are more aligned with the dynamics of iteration and co-creation. Hierarchies are not. And so when business leaders first feel the need to improve their organization's innovation capacity, their first move is often to set up an innovation department. However well-intentioned this may be, far too often, as I'm sure some of the people on the webinar realize, these innovation departments rarely produce results. That's because innovation's not a department. It's an operating system. And it cuts across all areas of the organization by altering the fundamental DNA of the management of the business so that creativity becomes the fundamental fabric of the organization through the free flow of both information and ideas. When creativity is indeed your organization's fundamental fabric, it dramatically changes the way that people, behaviors, communication, culture, and technology work together. To review some of the options for how businesses can make changes, let me turn it back to Andy.
Okay, thanks, Rod. So there we are. So the case for change, or the case for a new way of operating, I think Rod's described. But so what do you do? You know, what do you do? You're very lucky if you can start with a zero base where you're trying to create something new. But most organisations are in a position where they've got to move from where they are to where they want to be. So there are three basic options, I think, in our work that we've seen. The first is the lattice option around self-organising. The second is about a campus option, what we call a campus option. I'll describe that in a minute, about this flat meritocracy. And the final, the third option is a hybrid, a dual operating system, and that might be a first step for many organisations. So if we look at the lattice option in a little bit more detail, and Rod's already described organisations that have taken this message on board, that no one has authority to kill a good idea or keep a bad one alive. And in these sorts of organisations, as Rod described, there aren't any supervisors. The teams are self-organised, and they focus on tackling real problems, real business problems, and working together to collaborate and to tackle those issues. And a key issue in this environment is the peer accountability metric. So instead of being accountable just to a hierarchical system, you're accountable to each other, to delivering value for the organisation, and your peers can score and test against that. So it's used by a number of organisations as described below, Morningstar, etc. So Rod, do you want to talk about how that was seen in practice?
Sure. Let's give a couple of examples so our listeners can get a good picture of what a lattice organization looks like and how it works. And our first example is a company known as W.L. Gore & Associates, but most of you all probably know them by their most famous product, which is Gore-Tex. In 1958, Bill Gore left behind. He walked away from a 17-year career with one of America's most renowned companies, the DuPont Company, to literally start a business in his basement. Now, from day one, he knew he wanted his new business to be very different from the one that he had left. And that's because when he was at DuPont, he noticed that the best conversations didn't happen in the office. They didn't happen in the workplace when people were concerned about the chains of command and the hierarchies. They happened in the carpool. And so he had a very clear picture for how he wanted his new organization to look. He wanted it to be like a carpool all day long. And he knew if he was going to affect that, he needed to make sure that no one, including he, the founder, would have the authority to kill a good idea or keep a bad idea alive. So we concluded if that was going to be the case, then he needed to design an organization in which there were no organization charts, no protocols for communication. There would be no supervisors because all work would be accepted rather than assigned, and the collective intelligence of all the workers would decide what they would do and how they would do it. He thought, too, that if this was going to work, he needed to handle for two problems. The first was he had to make sure that people had incentive to do more work rather than less work, and to do the right work rather than the wrong work. And so the mechanic he came up with was that everyone in his new organization would rate about 20 people, and they would be rated by 20 people. And he felt that would be the mechanism that would make sure that things would get done in this new organization. Now think about it. This is 1958. If Bill Gore had asked anyone who knew anything in management about his new idea, they would have told him, "You're nuts." Because how will anything get done if nobody is in charge? Well, it turns out quite a lot can get done. Today, W.L. Gore & Associates is a 10,000 associate company in 30 countries around the world. It is a $3 billion enterprise that has made a profit every year since it first marketed its products. And it is one of only 3 or 4 companies who has been on Fortune's list of the best companies to work for every year since the list began. And today, in 2015, W.L. Gore & Associates still has no organization charts. It has no protocols for communication. It has no supervisors, because all work continues to be accepted rather than assigned. And the collective intelligence of the workers continues to decide what they do and how they do it. For those who think you cannot run a large organization unless you have a hierarchy, W.L. Gore & Associates is a 60-year experiment, if you will, that shows it definitely can be done. Another company that's been around for roughly 25 years, who also demonstrates it can be done, is Morningstar. Morningstar was a startup 25 years ago, and when Chris Ruffer, the founder, started the company, he decided there would be 2 foundational principles for his Lattice organization. Number 1, no one would have the ability to coerce another human being. And number 2, everyone in the organization would be expected to keep their commitments. And with those 2 foundational principles, he built an organization into what he called a self-management system from day one. This startup, using this management system, has today become the world's largest tomato processor with over $350 million in revenues. And what's astounding, this management model, which is used for its 400 full-time people all year round, also works for the 2,000 part-time employees who work for Morningstar during the harvest season. The key mechanic that makes their bossless structure work is what they call the colleague letter of understanding. And the way that works, every year at the end of the year, so they're probably doing it right about now, all of the workers at Morningstar sit down and do planning for the following year. And the way they do their planning is they make commitments to each other. And then those commitments are turned into metrics, and those metrics are captured in a colleague letter of understanding. It's essentially an individual contract that each person makes with their fellow colleagues for what they will deliver over the next year. And the metrics associated with these colleagues' letters of understanding are captured and posted every 2 weeks so that there's complete transparency about how everyone is doing in terms of meeting their commitments. And if it turns out that issues arise, they have a self-organized mediation process to resolve differences in which they continue to bring people into the circle of discussion until resolution is reached. So here are 2 solid examples of long-standing companies who have made bossless organizations, this lattice form of organization, work highly effectively. Andy, let me turn it back to you.
Cheers, Rod. Thanks. So the second option, the campus option, or the flat meritocracy, in this sort of organization, no one or no individual is smarter or faster than everybody or the collective. And in this sort of organization, the key couple of attributes there are, the first one is the working team leader. So team leaders actually, they're not just leading or managing, they are actually delivering. They are actually working and accountable to each other for actually delivering delivering content, delivering work, delivering added value. And in these sorts of organizations, there is a balance of both working in the teams and accountability for the teams with some autonomy for the teams, but also individual autonomy. And there are another number of organizations here, including Google, Whole Foods, and Apple, who have these sorts of attributes. So, Rod, do you talk to us a bit about Google then?
Sure, let's go through a couple of examples. And we all know Google. They were the last search engine in the market. Back in 1998, the last thing the world needed was another search engine. For those who remember those days, you may recall such names as Lycos and AltaVista. A crowded field of upstarts were in the search engine business, and it appeared at the time that the one that was going to break out was Yahoo. And the reason was, back then, the way search was done, it was done according to the selections of editorial experts, and Yahoo looked like it had the best editorial experts. But Larry Page and Sergey Brin, two grad students at Stanford at the time, had a different idea on how to do search. They looked out and said that over the next 10 years, the internet is going to explode and there'll be more pages than any editorial expert could ever keep up with. And it turned out that they were right. But back in 1998, that was their guess as to where the world was going. And so their idea was, rather than use editorial experts, we're going to use the wisdom of the crowd to rank the pages. We're going to leverage collective intelligence. And so they designed their algorithm, which is known as PageRank. And it was, as soon as it was introduced into the market, it quickly grabbed 2/3 of the search engine market space, a market position that they have not given up in almost 2 decades. If anyone on this webinar is skeptical about the power of collective intelligence, I would suggest that by your own choices, you are a believer in collective intelligence every time you use Google rather than another search engine. Because the difference between Google and every other search engine is collective intelligence. Now, although they innovated search technology, and many give them great credit for it, I would suggest that is not their greatest invention. Google's greatest invention was what they decided to do once their company took off. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were very mindful. They were not going to build a traditional organization. They were going to clearly eschew the idea of a top-down hierarchy. They decided they wanted to design their organization on the same model as their search engine. They wanted to leverage the collective intelligence of their people to enable unprecedented levels of innovation. They initially wanted to go bossless, and actually had experimented with it for about 4 months. But they got pushback for a very unusual space, and that was the workers, which surprised Page and Brin. And when they asked the workers, why do you want supervisors? We thought you would be happy. They said, well, we need mentors and we need referees. And I think this is the incredible wisdom of these 2 young men who I think have always been wise beyond their years. They didn't push back and say, well, we have decided this is it. They crafted a win-win. They thought to themselves, what they really don't want is micromanagement. That's their concern. They don't want people feeling that they're in charge, looking over others' shoulders. And they recognized that people wanted mentors and referees. So this is what they came up with. They said, okay, we'll bring back the supervisors, but we're going to keep the ratios at about 60-1, because you can't micromanage 60 people. And the other thing they put in place was 3M's practice of what has come to be known as 20% time. And the way that works is anybody at Google who has an idea is free to pursue it in their 20% time without having to check with a supervisor. And we told a little bit earlier the story of what happened in the pop-up ads. And so with these 2 mechanics in place, they were assured that no one in Google would have the authority to kill a good idea or keep a bad idea alive. And so today, Google has 55,000 employees, $66 billion in revenues in 2014. And I think perhaps most significantly, They are ranked #1 on Fortune's list of the best companies to work for. Google is the place that people would like to work at the best. A second example of a campus organization is Whole Foods. They were founded in about 1980. They operate more than 400 stores with self-governing units within the United States. Typically, each store consists of 8 units, such as produce, seafood, checkout, etc. But when you want to work at Whole Foods, you're not hired by a supervisor. You're hired by the team. And if you want to remain, well, you're going to have to pass muster with that team. Because when you join Whole Foods, you begin a probationary period that will be anywhere from 90 to 120 days. And only after that probationary period will you be offered full-time employment. And at the end of that probationary period, the team will decide whether or not you get to remain permanently on the team. And to stay requires a 2/3 vote of the team. Now, if the supervisor was in the 1/3 that said don't hire the person, but 2/3 of the team said we like that person, then you're hired, even though the supervisor may not want to have hired you. Because the founders of Whole Foods feel that the collective intelligence of the workers is a better selection criteria than the individual judgments of individual supervisors. The turnover rate at Whole Foods for full-time employees is less than 10% per year, and that's phenomenal for that type of a retail business. Today, they are 60,000 employees. They have $13 billion in annual revenues, and they too are a perennial presence on Fortune's list of the best companies to work for. Andy, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Rod. So the final of these 3 options, what we're calling the dual operating system, and I think this is the challenge that most legacy organizations have got. Is, we talked about the Google approach, etc., Whole Foods, and they set out to design their organization in a particular way and behave in a certain way. Most of us aren't in that world, and so when you're looking to have an operating system where you're shifting from sort of a long history of hierarchical management, this is perhaps the way forward. And there are 2 real types. There's one is the dual operating system. So both having these attributes, these flexible, agile attributes, and the sort of more hierarchical part. Also, this what we'll call a system within a system. So just to describe those in more detail, and these are sort of approaches that are taken forward by quite a lot of large organizations as described below. So if we look at these two types of hybrids then. So the first one, the dual operating system. The key with those is this is about addition of the self-organized network system along with this traditional hierarchy. And what it means is that individuals both have to work in this sort of flexible way of self-organizing teams and focus on a task, etc. But also they also have a hierarchy. So you can imagine it can be quite confusing. How does that relate to the incentives? Who are you trying to please? Are you trying to please your peers or your boss? How does that work? So that is an approach taken forward by some organizations, but clearly there are some tensions in how to operationalize that in practice, and the level of consistency in how the hierarchies and the line management work, and the effort and the amount of time you put into that for pleasing those sorts of people as opposed to the self-organized teams. The other approach, and this is goes back to really Rod's point right at the beginning of this about sort of an innovation team or department, etc. But this is more than that. This is about creating a team that actually does delivery. So it's a business unit focusing on this sort of self-organized, autonomous delivery. So they are accountable to one another, etc. Now, clearly, again, there's some challenges about who gets into that team, who doesn't. Do people move in and out of them? And there are challenges here again. And then perhaps these are interim steps, but the challenges here include, Do people want to move back into the hierarchical systems after they've been operating in this environment? How do the incentives work, again, within that sort of organization? So those are the sorts of hybrids that are certainly in place nowadays. So Rod, do you want to talk in a bit more detail about these?
Sure. And this is important to focus in on because, as Andy pointed out, this is probably the circumstance in which most organizations find themselves in this rapidly changing world. In the first two options that we talked about, the Lattice option and the campus options, all of our examples, they started the way they did from day one. Most business organizations who are trying to struggle with this new world in which we find ourselves in, they've got to transform themselves, and that's an entirely different challenge. And I think it's important to pay attention to this and not say, well, that's the way the other organizations set themselves up. That's for them. That's not how we do things. That's why we focus in the beginning on that we are in a changing world and we have to adapt to it. I think the importance of talking about the Lattice companies and the campus companies is all new large organizations that are born from here on in are highly likely to structure themselves either as Lattice or campus organizations. There has been no major organization, to our knowledge, that was born in the 21st century that is a top-down hierarchy. And so it's important to transform, and these two different options of the hybrid option, or the two different ways to do the hybrid option, are ways organizations can transition themselves. Neither of these two approaches is probably a sustainable situation. They are very highly effective transition situations. Now, the first, the dual operating system, is the creation of John Kotter, and it's outlined in his book, Accelerate. And the idea here is that the way that you begin to experience the power of the network is to set up a second operating system within the organization. So you retain your top-down hierarchy because oftentimes you're running the business, it's working well, and you don't want to change that. But what you do want to do is make sure you have an environment in which there can be a free flow of information and ideas. And that is the purpose of the side-by-side network structure. In the network structure, the rules have to be very different. So people's position and authority don't come into play in the dynamics of how this works. As we work with companies who might want to put this system in place, one of the things we may recommend to them is they adopt a system such as Holacracy, which provides rules for day-to-day meetings and how things get done when you don't have anybody in charge or a boss. And so that's the fundamental idea behind the dual operating system. The system within the system is one that I have more personal experience in because that was my own experience inside the Blue Cross Blue Shield Federal Employee Program. And there have been other examples of this. The Saturn project within General Motors, NUMMI, was a joint venture between Toyota and General Motors, was also a version of the system within a system. The Lincoln Continental project inside Ford is another example. So this has been tried in several places in the automotive industry. And the way this works is you introduce network management, into the organization in a particular business unit. So let me describe how we did it at Blue Cross Blue Shield. And a little background on the Blue Cross Blue Shield Federal Employee Program so you have some context. The program began in 1960. It had achieved a 63% market share, but in the mid-70s had a rapid loss of 24 points down to 39% in the mid-1970s. We had sustained 2 decades of low growth and low performance, and it recaptured only 4 points of our lost market share. So in the mid-1990s, we're sitting on a situation where we have now sustained again, 2 decades of low growth, low performance. And we decided we've got to turn this around. And so our first observation is it's probably the way we're managing that's driving the problem. And I think that this is probably a common insight that all of these different examples of system within a system had. The need to drive a higher performing organization. And so in our case, we recognize we need to manage differently. And because our particular business arrangement was an alliance of 39 organizations over whom we really didn't have true direct hierarchical control, we recognized it was nonsense to lead this enterprise as if we did, which was the problem. And the reason that we had used top-down hierarchical management, it's because it was all we ever learned. So we knew we had to learn a new way. And we knew more not what to do than rather what to do. And so over a period of time, we experimented with different ways of managing. And the unit developed the capacity, mainly through innovative meeting technologies, to rapidly collate the collective intelligence and to co-create shared understanding in a highly distributed business. And it was highly successful. Over the next 10 years, our market share increased by 16 points, and annual revenues rose from $6 billion to $19 billion. We became a high-performing, high-growth organization once again. Interestingly enough, in the other examples that I cited, the same phenomenon happened. They became high-performing, high-quality organizations. Now, the system within a system works as long as the leader of the business unit maintains this philosophy. But what oftentimes happens, and it clearly happened in the case of all the automotive examples, once the leader moved on, the traditional top-down hierarchical system wound up like weeds in a lawn, taking over the space. And so if the system within a system is used as an option, care needs to be taken that as the business unit develops the network techniques, they wind up morphing into the larger organization so that there can be a permanent transition into a management structure that will work for the 21st century. Andy, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Rod. So just begin to sum up then. So I think what we've described right at the beginning is that the pace of change is definitely accelerating, and therefore the need for organizations to work out how to move quickly, rapidly is a critical game changer, strategically a strategic imperative. So within this, so as the issues therefore at the same time become more complex, broader holistic thinking, collective intelligence is needed to not just take the data, but is also to look at the creativity and broadening out where the information is coming from and how it's all brought together and analyzed. And linked into that, therefore, we're in this very connected, hyper-connected world, and the best organizations and the ones that Rod's given examples of here, the best organizations build networks, not hierarchies. They focus on those networks, the collective intelligence, the ways of operating, and the sort of the value is in the idea as opposed to the person who communicated it. So those are those key messages. So Rod, what's the final disciplines then?
So let's leave our listeners with a final thought. Andy before pointed out how the vanguard companies are thriving and listed some of those. And we at Optimity Advisors did some literature research to understand the dynamics behind this new management model. And one of the things that jumped out at us is that the vanguard companies engage in 5 disciplines, which are the foundation for this new networked approach to management. 5 disciplines that are rarely, if ever, practiced inside traditional organizations, yet these are the lifeblood of these innovative organizations. The first is they focus on what matters to customers. And this isn't lip service. This isn't stuff on a placard. This is real. As a matter of fact, it's so real that the leaders of the vanguard companies are literally changing the fundamental purpose of a business. Most of us who went through MBA-type programs were taught on the first day of business school that the purpose of a business is to create shareholder wealth. The leaders of the Vanguard companies don't believe that at all. They feel the purpose of a business is to create customer value. This isn't to say that they don't think shareholder wealth is important. They think it's very important. They just understand the wisdom that without customers, you're not going to have any shareholders. So the pathway to shareholder wealth is always through customer value. And interestingly enough, on average, the Vanguard companies have greater shareholder wealth than their traditional counterparts. Secondly, as we talked about all throughout this webinar, they have the capacity to aggregate and leverage collective intelligence. And thirdly, they also have the ability to build shared understanding among distributed workforces. And they do this by creating holistic, data-tested solutions. The problems with hierarchies is they can't think and act holistically. The power of networks is they can. And holistic thinking is a better strategy for problem solving in a rapidly changing world. Fourth, they allow their workers to independently keep score. In these network-based organizations, you don't have to ask a supervisor whether we're winning or losing. You know it directly, and you know it through the metric systems. Morningstar is a great example of that through their colleague letter of understanding metrics. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the Vanguard companies, they naturally enable peer-to-peer collaboration and accountability. This was the great insight of Bill Gore. How will things get done if nobody's in charge? By making people accountable to all of their peers. And it turns out that peer accountability is a far greater driver of accountability than making people report to single supervisors. James, let me turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Andy and Rod. We received a lot of great questions, which we'll move on to in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about wiki management. So this is a book by Rod, and it really goes into some really nice detail about some of the ideas you've been introduced to today. I read it this weekend. It reads very well, and it's a very nice way to kind of build on these ideas, and it's very practical, and a lot of the stuff can be implemented in your business or your organization. So let's move on to a couple of questions. So the first question is for you, Rod, and it is, the idea of organizing companies as self-organized networks sounds great, but is it practical? Put simply, how will anything get done if there's no clear chain of command?
Okay, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, and this is a question that always comes up when I do keynote speaking on this. We have been raised in an educational system where we have just been taught to value individual intelligence and the person with the bright idea. And then giving that person the ability to direct the work of others has just been ingrained into our mental DNA. So understanding how networks work is going to take a paradigm shift in our fundamental beliefs about how things get done. But I think once that transition is made, and if you experiment with some of the different practices that are outlined in the book, Wiki Management, you will begin to see incredible results. Once an organization is able to tap into the power of collective intelligence and build broad-based shared understanding, then the vast majority of the workers don't need tight direction anymore because they understand the fundamentals of what we need to do to get from here to there. We have highly intelligent knowledge workers who can connect the dots between what they do and what's important to the company, and they will astound you with what they can get done through this self-organized way of working. If I could describe the impact, before we personally used this methodology when I was with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Federal Employee Program, when we were operating as a top-down hierarchy, I can't tell you how many times people would come into my office and say, "You're not going to believe what so-and-so did." And then they would tell me, and I would just drop my head and go, "Oh my God, who thought of that?" When we began to work in the network structure, people would come into my office and tell me what people had done on their own. And I would brighten up and say, "Wow, who thought of that?" That's what happens when you tap into the power of collective intelligence. And when you enable self-organization and see its results, you wind up getting more done than you ever thought was possible, because everything doesn't have to run through you anymore. And you've created a structure in which people are working in an aligned fashion around the mission of a business. This is what makes companies like Google and like Gore and Morningstar so incredibly, incredibly effective.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. There's kind of a follow-up question that I've been asked, and that is, how do you change someone's mindset within the organization? So how do you implement this?
That's a very good question, because that is at the heart of the challenge. Stephen Denning, who writes for Forbes, has organized a learning consortium this year. They began in January of 2015, of companies who are practicing this alternative management structure, especially those who are using Agile, which is very consistent with this new management philosophy. And after these companies had all visited each other and learned from each other, the most important observation that Steve Denning walked away from these visits was, the new management model is not necessarily a set of methodologies. What it is a major shift in mindset. And all of these different companies did very different things. You really couldn't find one formula among them, but what you did find was one common mindset. And it was a mindset that work is about iteration and co-creation, that collective intelligence is incredibly important, and that you have to build processes in order to tap into it. But there are many processes that will get that done. But in the end, it comes down to a fundamental belief in people within an organization that if you have the right structures, you can trust that they will get things done. And what is inherent in hierarchical management is a fundamental distrust of workers, that they will go astray unless the supervisor is pulling the levers of power. What the vanguard companies understand is that the levers of power are all about getting people highly connected, and as has been articulated very clearly by the leaders of Google. Eric Schmidt writes about this in his book, How Google Works. Their fundamental philosophy is hire good people, get out of their way. But that is a fundamental mindset shift, but it is very necessary to manage in this rapidly changing world.
Okay. All right, we have time for one more question, and it's directed towards you, Andy. And the question is, why do some companies innovate and move forward, whereas why do some remain behind?
Okay, so it's a good question. So I think it just pulls on what Rod has just been talking about, and no organization and no individual wants to do badly when they go to work. So everybody comes to work with best intentions, etc. And organizations don't necessarily understand that. They're sort of stuck in the way of the hierarchy. So ultimately, it just goes what Rod says. People are getting in the way of the good ideas. So the hierarchies are getting in the way of the good ideas. And when you're used, though, to operating in that way with the hierarchies and who's coming up with the idea, people are very precious about it. So they're sort of quite reserved. They don't want to share the information. They're not in a trusting environment. If you say the wrong thing, is somebody going to come down on you, etc. If you set the tone, the culture, etc., in a way which doesn't promote idea sharing and collaboration, then clearly you're not going to innovate. You're not going to be able to come up with the new products. You're not going to identify the risks, etc., etc. Now that takes for people that are used to the traditional hierarchies, that have been trained in that way, they're looking at sort of traditional management textbooks, etc., been operating that way for decades. The trust to shift to a completely different way of doing it is a big leap of faith. So, I think it's really a question of exposing yourselves to other ways of doing stuff. How are these people doing it? Let us go and see other companies and how they operate. Seeing is believing. And then until people understand that there potentially could be better ways of doing, there is a necessity to change the way that things are operating. But this processing power, etc., and the speed of change does need to accelerate. Unless you accept that the status quo isn't an option, you won't look for these new options and these new opportunities. And so at the heart of it, I think there's this a key challenge is understanding that there is that need for change. And if you're not looking for it and you don't understand that that's there, then you're not going to continue to renew and innovate in any sort of way. So I think it's the fundamental behavior of leaders that have been very successful in the past and don't necessarily know and understand that there are other ways of doing things that could potentially be better.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. Well, we've run out of time this afternoon for any more questions, but we will follow up with those of yours questions which we haven't been able to answer. Thanks very much for joining us. I will introduce the next webinar now, which is about how we can change to a network organization. So today we've gone through why it's so important to adopt networks, and next time we will be going through how this can actually happen. And everyone will be invited who has attended this website via an email link. But thanks very much for tuning into this webinar, and we hope to see you at the next one.